So my talk is about the Samba project. So we're going to be talking for the next few minutes about how to contribute to Samba, the Samba open source project. This is going to be a really heavy content talk. So feel free to go back and watch the talk after the fact. Samba is a GPL3 project which focuses on interoperability between Windows and various Unixes, such as Linux and Mac OS. It covers a pretty broad base of things from an Active Directory client to an SMB file share server, and even provides an Active Directory domain controller. So regardless of your background, you may find something here that interests you. I like to use Slido to communicate with the audience. So if you want to pull this up, enter in that code, then you can send me feedback. I also have the QA on there. You can Q&A. You can also do Q&A here in the Zoom call. I don't care how you do that. But also be asking a couple of simple questions along the way that you can actively participate in. We won't have a lot of time to go over your responses, but maybe we'll hit them at the end. So a brief introduction. I'm married. I have 5 kids. I'm a software engineer at SUSE, and I'm a Samba team member. I have a master's degree in computer science, and I work from home on my little farm here in Utah in the United States. On the side, I work as a voluntary firefighter. So kind of interesting tidbit about me. I've been working on the Samba project for 5 years, and I joined the Samba team 2 years ago. So everything we're discussing today, I had to learn recently, past couple of years myself. Throughout my presentation, you'll see I'll have QR codes up in the corner of the screen. So keep your phone handy and you can open links for various things, the topics that we're discussing, or you can come back and review the video and open the links later. I figured this was an easier approach than trying to throw links on the page because you can't click on them, you know. So your most important resource after my presentation and your best resource when you make your first contribution to Samba is going to be the Samba contribute page on our wiki. Most of the material from this discussion will come from this page. So feel free to open that now, or you can reference it later. I helped write a lot of this page. So before we start talking about anything else, let's first introduce Samba's code conventions. Getting this right the first time will reduce unnecessary patch reformatting. You may not agree with or like the guidelines, but contributors to the Samba project must abide by them. So you don't want to rely on copying the format of existing Samba code, since the guidelines weren't always in place in the past. And if you get these right the first time, you can save yourself a headache. Now, most open source projects will have their own separate code guidelines. And I've worked in a number of different projects, open source projects, and you just have to follow the guidelines of each project in order to get your code submitted. You can find the Samba code conventions at the root of the Samba source tree in the README coding file, or by visiting the link here. I'm not going to cover all of the nitty-gritty details, but we'll hit on the important highlights. Make sure you thoroughly review these guidelines before your first contribution. So some of the highlights. The maximum line width in a Samba project is 80 characters. The reason is to try to discourage you from nesting more than one level of blocks. A helper script is provided to check when you're done, but the best practice is to write your code correctly from the get-go. This one is a kind of a pet peeve of mine. I don't like this rule, but I have to abide by it. And it does help keep you from doing silly things in your code. Use 8-space tabs, C code. Don't use spaces. Python, of course, is an exception where you use 4-space tabs and four spaces instead. Python or Samba is primarily written in C code and Python, a mixture of the two. Do not leave trailing white space at the end of your code lines. We've also got a helper script to strip those out. And follow the KNR guidelines, with one clear exception, which is always put braces around a block, even single statement blocks. That's for C code, of course. The reason has to do with some nasty bugs that we've encountered in the past. So what can you contribute to Samba? Now, naturally, I'm going to be talking about contributing source code, but that's not your only option. The Samba project is a large community of volunteers, and you might think you need to know C or Python to help, but that really isn't true. There are lots of necessary tasks in the project that don't require special skills. For example, you can improve documentation, answer user questions, and triage issues on the mailing list. That's super helpful. You can update and provide wiki articles if you use Samba. You can help with testing, particularly of upcoming releases. You can report bugs in Bugzilla. That's particularly helpful. Help to verify patches in Bugzilla. If you are familiar with patch management, you could create patches if you're a developer, and then anything else really that you can imagine. So, like I said, we're not going to hang out on this page, but this is one of the questions I wanted to ask. What are you most interested in contributing to Samba? I figure if you're watching this video or later, or if you're participating live here, that you may have a reason why you're listening, and maybe there's something that you would be interested in contributing. And I'd like to know so that I can see the results later. And maybe I'll share if we have some results at the end. So I'm going to talk about preparing your environment. This, of course, applies to Samba development specifically. And in order to do that, you'll need to do some specific setup on your system. Of course, you'll need to clone the Samba repository. The official mirror is on GitLab. There is a mirror on GitHub, but it's not the official mirror. You should be contributing new features, of course, to our master branch, and we can backport patches later if necessary. So to prepare your system to build Samba, you'll need to run the appropriate Bootstrap script for your operating system. The Bootstrap scripts are found in that Bootstrap generated dist directory in the Samba tree. When you run that script, it'll install various packages that'll allow you to build. And then let's talk about submitting patches to the project. Oh, and here's another question you can answer on the Slido presentation. So first, if you already work in the industry and you have your own preferences on how you contribute source code, I'd like to hear what you guys are currently using. So when you make your first merge request, of course, we use GitLab. When you make your first merge request in GitLab, make sure you start fairly small. Unless you're just submitting something small like a spelling fix or whatever, then you need to review the full instructions on creating a patch series, which I'll talk about in a minute. But then you of course need a GitLab account. Some development is done on GitLab. You have to you can sign in with a GitHub account on GitLab, which is convenient if you're familiar with GitHub. And then you'll need to you need to fork the Samba repo in GitLab. And this will be sufficient making small contributions, but for ongoing contributions, then we'll add you to our Samba Devel group. It's important that you change the CI timeout. That's continuous integration testing, because the Samba project's testing is really slow and long. Takes a long time. 3 hours should be sufficient. When you're preparing your patches, make sure each commit is as small as possible. Now this falls in line with, this is really good general advice for submitting to open source. Each commit should change only one small thing. This will simplify the review process in the long run, because you got to keep in mind that these are volunteers that are reviewing your patches. And if you've got one big giant blob, then most people won't want to look at it. Each commit message should have a specific description about what the commit does, and bug fix patches need to contain a bug tag in the commit message. Since Samba has a distributed copyright ownership, you have to follow our copyright policy to ensure that we clearly have permission and that you intend to contribute to Samba. And the license and you intend to contribute to the GPL3 license. Our copyright policy also requires that you add mandatory commits to every tag, little signed off by tags, saying you're releasing the copyright. A good commit message will have a short summary of the fix or the feature, plus a more verbose description after that, and then a bug number if there's a related bug. If you need to add information to release notes, you'll add an RN tag, and then of course your signed off by tag. And there's a little example to show you what it's supposed to look like. In Samba, you're expected to provide your own quality assurance. So the way we do this is through automated testing. Most changes you make to Samba should include an automated test for either bug fixes or new features being added. Now, something to keep in mind is that you do have to test all of your code. On previous projects I've been in, we had a separate QA department. In Samba, you are your own QA. If you don't test your code, no one else is obligated to do so. So it may end up broken. So most tests you run using make test from the Samba tree. There are several different ways to create the tests, but in general, you either use our torture test framework or Python unit tests. If you're familiar with testing frameworks, why don't you go ahead and share? We'll review that later. When you make your first merge request, you'll push to our private clone to your own private clone of Samba, and then submit the merge request, and then a Samba team member will review your request and post comments. You should be aware that this is sometimes a very slow process, and it takes time because it's a project run on volunteers. Don't be upset if you get ignored. You can ping team members if you think that it's been a while and nobody's noticed it. One important thing to keep in mind is that we know you take pride in your work, and everyone does, but don't be offended when someone requests changes to your code. Accept their review as a compliment that they saw your work is valuable. If your work is ignored, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not valuable. It could just mean that there's no one interested or familiar. More likely, there's no one familiar with what you're doing, and you may need to explain what you're working on in more detail. And this is general good advice anytime you submit to any open source project. You're going to want to don't be offended because sometimes the public contributors can be a little bit rude, or they may sound rude and may not intend to. So don't take offense. Just take it as a compliment that they appreciate your work. Okay, now here's an example of a very bad merge request. It's happens to be a real example, which I came across a couple of years ago. This is what I would call throwing crap at the wall until something sticks. The engineer here kept just committing random changes until he ended up with something that worked. I assume he was trying to get his CI to pass his tests. So this merge request contains 47 commits total. The merge request title doesn't seem to have anything to do with the change that he actually made. And the final result is this single line code change of just adding the words on Friday. And I'll remind you, this was a real merge request and it was awful. So assuming the cumulative code change here listed is what was intended, which isn't at all obvious, these 47 commits should have been rebased into a single commit. If you're not familiar with Git terminology, a rebase means that you squash them all together, squish them into a single commit. And then they should have written a test to test the change. Now here's an example of a good merge request. This one only has 2 commits. The first commit being the bug fix. The second commit containing tests for the issue. The merge request title is very specific, mentioning the component being patched and the function being patched, and explaining briefly what was fixed. And then the patch contents only can modify the single thing being fixed.
David,
Yeah.
apologies for interrupting. Let's go maybe 3 or 4 more minutes or so.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I apologize for rushing in any way, shape, or form. I just we're a few minutes after 1, and want to try to we'll try to wrap up by about 1:15 today or so. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
I'll run through some of these briefly then. After you've submitted one merge request, then we can add you to the Samba Devel community, and then you get to share our Samba Devel repo with, and it includes CI resources. Be courteous. Don't override other people's work. Here's an important one. Also applies to community at large. When you're submitting patches, consider each patch as like a string of polished pearls. The quality of the end result depends on the quality of each element. We talked a little bit about CI. How to make the best of your code review. This is important. It's your responsibility to make sure the most of your code, or make the most of your code review. Code reviews like a game of tennis. You have to keep hitting the ball back over the net to stay in the game. Make sure you go back over reviews and ensure you've done everything they asked, etc. So how can you get involved in the Samba project? There's coding opportunities. We don't have any Summer of Code, Google Summer of Code opportunities this year, but we have many times in the past. So if you're interested, contact the Samba project. You can also review the Samba roadmap on our wiki. It is kept pretty up to date and has projects that you could start on. It's also important that you communicate with the Samba community. You can connect with us on Matrix or join the mailing list. Those links you can find here on our QR code. And it'd also be important to join us at our conference, Samba XP, in just less than a month now, starting. Okay, and so I'm done. Somebody asked, thinking of using Samba for a house network share, so my wife and I can have files saved elsewhere or share a central file repository. Is this a valid use? Oh yeah, sure. You can use Samba for a local network share. You can run Samba on a Raspberry Pi on a small little NAS setup.